Ever wondered how people kept food fresh before electricity? Back in medieval times, they couldn't just pop leftovers in the fridge or order takeout when the pantry was empty. They had to get creative, really creative. Some of their methods were brilliant, others were bizarre, and a few were downright hilarious. And nowhere was this creativity more evident than in the medieval kitchens. These wild and busy places were nothing like our sparkly clean ones today. Instead of fridges, they had dangling meats, herbs hanging everywhere, and more salt than a pretzel factory. The kitchen was the heart of any medieval home, always smoky, warm, and filled with interesting smells. These kitchens stored the basics: preserved meats, dried veggies, and tons of bread. The funny thing is, they didn't have any of our modern must-haves. Imagine trying to explain ketchup to a medieval cook. They had to start storing food as soon as spring arrived because winter was no joke, and trust me, they couldn't exactly order pizza when times got tough. Speaking of storing food, it all began with salt. You wouldn't believe this, but salt was so precious that Roman soldiers got paid in it. That's where we get the word salary from. Pretty crazy, right? And in medieval times, some smart traders in Venice built entire fortunes just by controlling the salt trade. These guys were like the medieval version of tech billionaires, except instead of selling smartphones, they were selling tiny white crystals. Here's how salting worked. They'd rub meat or fish with tons of salt, sometimes using up to 20% of the food's weight in salt alone. The meat would then shrivel up like a raisin in the sun, but that was exactly what they wanted. The salt basically turned the food into a medieval version of beef jerky. One recipe from a 13th century kitchen said to salt the meat until it looks like it's covered in snow, which honestly sounds like my cooking when I accidentally knock over the salt shaker. The coolest part? They found ways to salt practically everything. Fish got packed in barrels with layers of salt, kind of like a really unappetizing lasagna. Pork became ham and bacon. Even vegetables got in on the action. They made sauerkraut by salting cabbage until it fermented. Medieval doctors actually thought all this salt was good for you. Bet they'd have a heart attack if they saw our modern health guidelines. But there was a huge problem with relying on salt. It was expensive. A pound of salt could cost a week's wages for a regular worker. My favorite story is about a medieval French village that traded an entire flock of sheep just for enough salt to last the winter. But when salt was hard to come by, medieval folks turned their kitchens into smokehouses. And I mean that literally. The entire room would be filled with so much smoke that if a medieval cook walked into a modern BBQ joint, they'd probably feel right at home. Except medieval kitchens didn't have those fancy exhaust fans we use today, which meant everyone probably smelled like smoked bacon 24/7. Not that anyone was complaining. Smelling like bacon beats smelling like, well, whatever else people smelled like in medieval times. The smoking process was actually pretty genius. They'd hang meat or fish high up in special chimneys or in the kitchen rafters where the smoke from cooking fires would slowly work its magic. The best woods for smoking were oak, apple, and cherry, each adding its own special flavor. One medieval German cookbook even listed specific wood types for different meats: oak for beef, apple for pork, and cherry for poultry. Talk about being picky with your smoke. Fun fact, archaeologists found a perfectly preserved smokehouse from 1375 in London. And guess what? The ceiling beams still smelled like smoke even after 600 years. These guys really knew what they were doing. The smoke didn't just make food taste good, it created a protective layer that kept bugs and bacteria away. It's like they invented an all-natural food force field. But smoking wasn't just for meat. They smoked cheese too, which helped it last way longer. Some of today's most famous cheeses, like smoked Gouda, started as medieval preservation techniques. They even smoked grains to keep them from getting moldy, though I bet that made for some interesting tasting bread. My favorite discovery was that they sometimes smoked eggs. Imagine trying to explain that to your chickens. Sorry girls, but your eggs are going to smell like a campfire. The really fancy medieval homes had separate smokehouses, complete with different levels for different foods. The top level was for lighter smoking, like fish, the middle for medium smoking, like pork, and the bottom near the fire was for heavy smoking, like beef. It was basically a medieval version of a multi-level parking garage, except instead of cars, it was filled with dangling food. But what happened when smoking wasn't enough? Well, that's when medieval folks turned to nature's freezer. And trust me, they got pretty creative with snow and ice. because deep underground cellars were like the medieval version of a Frigidaire. Except instead of an ice maker, you had servants running around in winter collecting snow and ice like it was some kind of frozen treasure hunt. The really wealthy nobles had special buildings called ice houses. These weren't your average garden sheds. They were more like underground ice bunkers. The biggest one ever found was at Hampton Court Palace. And get this, it could hold 75 tons of ice. That's enough to make slushies for an entire medieval army. The ice houses were built kind of like upside-down ice cream cones, dug deep into the ground with super thick walls. Some rich folks even hired ice masters whose only job was to keep the ice from melting. Talk about a cool job title. Here's a wild fact. Medieval ice houses worked so well that some of them kept ice frozen for up to 2 years. The secret? They packed sawdust between layers of ice, which worked like a medieval version of insulation, and you thought your cooler at the beach was impressive, but what if you weren't rich enough to have your own personal ice fortress? Well, that's where caves and stone cellars came in handy. Natural caves stayed at a pretty steady 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit all year round, perfect for keeping food freshish. Medieval people would store their cheese, eggs, and vegetables in these cool spots. Some monasteries even built their own artificial caves just for storing wine and beer. Those monks knew their priorities. The funniest part about medieval cold storage was how they'd pack perishable food in snow during winter parties. Imagine being a medieval party planner. Okay, we need 3 barrels of wine, 2 roasted pigs, and enough snow to keep the fish from going bad. And maybe extra snow for snowball fights. They'd actually serve frozen desserts at fancy feasts, basically medieval snow cones flavored with honey or fruit juices. And yes, sometimes they'd write warnings like, "Don't eat the yellow snow," even back then. Some jokes never get old. But winter doesn't last forever unless you're living in medieval Iceland, and eventually all that lovely ice would melt away. That's when medieval folks had to turn to their backup plan, drying everything in sight. And when I say everything, I mean everything. Medieval people turned food drying into an art form. They dried absolutely everything that didn't run away first. Meat became jerky, grapes turned into raisins, and plums transformed into prunes. They'd string up fruits and vegetables on long ropes, hanging them from their rafters like medieval Christmas decorations. The whole house probably looked like some kind of weird food festival that never ended. Did you know they even had special drying towers? These tall buildings had open sides with wooden slats to let air flow through while keeping birds out. One famous tower in France could dry over 2,000 pounds of fruit at once. That's more fruit than a modern grocery store keeps in stock. They'd load these towers up with pears, apples, figs, you name it. The locals called them fruit castles, which honestly sounds like a way better name than food dehydrator. Some of these towers still exist today, and archaeologists found dried fruit bits stuck in the corners that are over 500 years old. Talk about ancient snacks. The really clever part was how they figured out different drying techniques for different foods. Herbs got bundled up and hung upside down, making medieval kitchens look like they were decorated by someone who really loved plants. Meat was cut into super thin strips, the thinner the better, because nobody wanted to bite into a piece of half-dried beef. That's just asking for a medieval stomachache. They even had special drying rooms with little windows that could be opened or closed depending on the weather, like a medieval version of climate control. Medieval cookbooks actually had specific instructions about drying food. One from the 1300s says, "Cut your meat as thin as a monk's patience during Lent." Another one warned, "If your dried beef bounces when dropped, you've done it right. If it shatters, you've created a weapon." They dry fish too, beating it flat first until it was practically paper thin. These dried fish were so hard, you could probably use them as roof tiles in an emergency. In fact, there's a story about Norwegian sailors using dried fish as plates. Talk about reducing your dishes. The best part about dried food, it was incredibly lightweight. A whole cow dried down to the size of a modern backpack. Armies loved this. They could carry weeks' worth of food without needing a wagon train. Medieval armies actually had special officers in charge of dried food supplies. These guys had the exciting title of Keeper of the Dry Stores, which probably wasn't the most impressive title at medieval parties. Although I bet soldiers got pretty tired of gnawing on beef jerky day after day. What's for dinner tonight, Captain? Dried beef. And tomorrow? Still dried beef? Next week? Take a wild guess. But sometimes just drying food wasn't enough, especially in places where the weather was too humid or rainy. That's when medieval folks turned to their secret weapon, vinegar. Because the medieval world was absolutely crazy about vinegar and fermentation. You couldn't walk into a medieval kitchen without bumping into barrels of fermenting vegetables. They pickled everything, and I mean everything. Cabbage turned into sauerkraut, cucumbers became pickles, and they even fermented fish. One recipe from a medieval German cookbook just says, put it in vinegar until it stops smelling like fish and starts smelling like regret. Some historians think medieval Europeans pickled more food per person than any other civilization in history. The science behind fermentation is pretty cool. You know how your mom tells you not to let food go bad? Well, medieval people actually let food go bad in exactly the right way. They discovered that certain types of good bacteria could fight off the bad bacteria that makes you sick. A single barrel of sauerkraut could feed a family through winter and give them enough vitamin C to avoid scurvy. That's right, medieval people were fighting off pirate diseases before pirates were even cool. Tests on surviving medieval recipes showed their fermented foods had more beneficial bacteria than most modern probiotic supplements. Some monasteries had entire rooms dedicated to fermentation. The monks kept detailed records of their pickling experiments, which is how we know that one monastery in France pickled over 15,000 eggs in a single year. Can you imagine being the poor monk in charge of that job? Brother John, what's your holy duty? Oh, I pickle eggs, thousands of them. My hands perpetually smell like vinegar, and I haven't tasted anything else in 3 years. The monks even wrote poems about pickling. There's one that goes on for 50 verses about the proper way to ferment turnips. But the real pickling champions were the Vikings. These guys took fermentation to a whole new level. They made something called lutefisk, fermented fish soaked in lye until it became jelly-like. Yes, you read that right. They deliberately turned perfectly good fish into fish jelly. Even better, they considered it a delicacy. There's an old Norse saying that translates to, "A brave man fears many things, but only a fool fears not the lutefisk." Archaeological digs have found Viking fermentation barrels that still contain traces of fish after 1,000 years, though thankfully nobody's tried to taste them. The best part about fermented foods? They actually got better with age, unlike that sandwich you forgot in your backpack. Some medieval noble families had barrels of pickled vegetables that they passed down through generations like family heirlooms. Here, son, I pass to you this sacred barrel of pickled turnips. It was your great-grandfather's dying wish that you continue adding vinegar to it. One barrel of pickled cabbage found in an English castle had been continuously maintained for over 40 years. They also used fermentation to make medicine. Got a headache? Try some fermented cabbage juice? Upset stomach? Here's some pickled radish. Medieval doctors prescribed fermented foods for everything from the common cold to broken bones. I guess when all you have is a barrel of pickles, everything looks like a pickling problem. One medieval hospital went through over 50 gallons of fermented vegetable juice every month, though whether this helped the patients or just gave them something else to complain about is still debated. But if you wanted to preserve something really special, something that needed to last for years, there was an even sweeter option: honey. And the coolest thing about it? It never goes bad. Never. Scientists once found 3,000-year-old honey in Egyptian tombs that was still perfectly good to eat, though maybe don't go raiding ancient tombs for a midnight snack. Medieval people knew about honey's superpower and used it for pretty much everything. They'd pour it over fruits, meats, and even whole birds to preserve them. One recipe from a medieval cookbook suggests preserving a whole peacock in honey, because apparently regular chicken wasn't fancy enough. Medieval beekeepers were like rock stars. They had special legal protections and could even get away with trespassing if they were chasing after their bees. Records from one English manor show they paid their beekeeper more than their cook, which tells you exactly how much they valued their honey supply. A good beekeeper could manage up to 100 hives, producing enough honey to preserve food for an entire village. The really wild part is how they used honey in medicine. Got a nasty cut? Slap some honey on it. Can't sleep? Honey and warm milk. Bad case of bubonic plague? Well, honey probably wouldn't help with that, but they tried it anyway. Medieval doctors wrote entire books about honey-based medicines. One famous doctor prescribed honey water for everything from toothaches to broken hearts. though I suspect the broken heart patients would have preferred chocolate. Here's a crazy fact. Some medieval castles had special honey rooms. These were warm, dry spaces where they stored their honey-preserved foods. The walls would get all sticky from honey drips, and apparently, bugs would get stuck to them like medieval flypaper. One castle's records complain about having to scrape the walls clean every spring because the honey rooms have caught more flies than food. Rich people would preserve exotic fruits in honey to show off their wealth. Oh, you've never had honey-preserved lemons from Sicily? How common. They'd serve these fancy preserved fruits at feasts, probably making everyone else feel bad about their regular old pickled turnips. Some nobles even had special honey-preserved fruit collections, kind of like medieval Pokemon cards. Gotta preserve them all. The funniest part was how they tested if honey was pure enough for preservation. They'd drop a chicken feather in it. If the feather sank too quickly, the honey was too watery. One medieval text warns, if your honey cannot hold a feather, it cannot hold your dinner. They also believed that the best preserving honey came from bees that had visited holy sites, because obviously religious bees make better honey. But what if you wanted to preserve something and make it more fun at the same time? Well, that's where alcohol came in, because nothing says food preservation like drowning your fruits in wine. Medieval people discovered that alcohol wasn't just for getting tipsy at feasts, it was actually an amazing food preservative. Fruits, vegetables, and even eggs could last for months when soaked in wine or beer. One medieval French castle went through over 100,000 liters of wine a year, and only half of it was for drinking. The rest, they used it to preserve everything from cherries to whole geese. You've got to love their logic here. This wine keeps us feeling good. Maybe it'll keep our food feeling good too. And you know what? They were absolutely right. The alcohol killed off bacteria and kept food from spoiling. Some medieval monasteries had entire cellars dedicated to alcohol-preserved foods. The monks would spend their days preserving fruits in wine and then writing poetry about it. Talk about living your best medieval life. The most popular preserved treats were drunken fruits. Basically, medieval cocktail garnishes. They'd soak plums, cherries, and peaches in spiced wine until they turned into boozy little flavor bombs. One recipe warns, these fruits will make you twice as merry as regular fruits. They even preserved meat in alcohol, though that was probably more about desperation than taste. Nothing says we're running out of options, quite like a chicken floating in a barrel of beer. Here's a weird one. They preserved eggs in alcohol. They'd crack them into barrels of wine or beer where they'd sort of pickle. Medieval taverns actually served these boozy eggs as bar snacks, because apparently regular pickled eggs weren't interesting enough. There's a story about a merchant who tried to eat 3 wine-preserved eggs on a bet and ended up singing tavern songs in Latin, and he didn't even know Latin. The really fancy folks got creative with their alcohol preservation. They'd layer fruits with different kinds of wine to create pretty patterns in the storage jars. One noble family had a special barrel where they preserved fruit in layers of red and white wine, making it look like a striped medieval flag. Real medieval Instagram material right there. Records from a royal kitchen show they spent more on preservation wine than they did on meat. Though knowing medieval royalty, they probably drank half the preservation supply anyway. But the absolute best part, they figured out that stronger alcohol worked better for preservation. This led to some, let's say, enthusiastic research into distillation. No, my lord, I'm not making extra strong wine for fun. It's for preserving these, very important royal pairs. Yes, that's it. Royal pairs. And there you have it. Medieval preservation done 7 different ways. From simple salt to fancy wine, they figured out how to keep their food edible through thick and thin. Next time you open your fridge, thank your medieval ancestors for figuring out all these preservation tricks. Though maybe skip the wine-soaked eggs,